Hora's mother, Lamia, has also been wounded by shrapnel. Swift help seems to have saved her life, but the scars of war will undoubtedly take time to heal. Carl Penhall for CNN, Samoa, Iraq.
It took place during last night, as I have mentioned, in a very new, innovative way. And I meant by that, as I have indicated yesterday, by martyrdom and by new ways in this kind of fighting against those mercenaries. That really took place. We crushed the forces in Saddam International Airport, and we cleaned the whole place of the airport by our Republican Guard. Now the Republican Guard is in full control of Saddam International Airport, and those mercenaries now outside the airport in Abu Ghraib district, and they are surrounded, and we are pounding them by missiles and heavy artillery. The whole trend had been changed. Now the operation moving in our interest
is a last attempt by a dying regime. These are some of the last press conferences they're going to be giving. I would invite the Information Minister to come on down to the airport if he has any question about if American forces and coalition forces are actually there and what we're doing. We'd invite him to come down and meet us and inspect it.
Yeah, well, he's already said he's going to take journalists down later in the afternoon when they've cleared it. But my specific question is, he's saying that all your forces have been expelled from the airport. Is that the case or not?
It's absolutely false.
Right, then you say that's not the case. Now, what's happening elsewhere in the city? Because the ICRC is saying that there are now significant, several hundred casualties. Are you getting reports of significant engagements now somewhere in the city?
We have engagements. I can tell you that there are armed combat formations in the heart of Baghdad. We are running into some enemy resistance and fighters. But as we meet those, we're identifying those elements of resistance and eliminating those as we see fit.
This morning, more ammunition was flown in for the strike planes. It promises to be an intense weekend for the Kitty Hawk battle group. So far, the Kitty Hawk strike planes have dropped over 300 tons of bombs over Iraq. 90% were precision-guided, a trend that will be maintained in the final assault on Baghdad. Brian Barron, BBC News, with the US 5th Fleet.
It's from the camera, which normally provides the live shot of the city centre. But here, this is, I'm not sure we've even seen this before in the centre of Baghdad, military equipment being moved around the city. We've also seen, we'll come to that shortly, people jumping around and cars with sirens running around. Now, all of this comes, not exactly moving in a hurry, this one, but all of this comes as we get the reports of, there we go, this poster of Saddam Hussein being pushed out the window there, the front vehicle, the Iraqi flag. All of this coinciding with the coalition saying that they have penetrated into the centre of the city.
An awful lot of photos of Saddam Hussein, also an awful lot of guns being waved out of a large number of car windows. We'll get a better sense of that in the next few seconds. And these particular shots here correlate very much with what our correspondent in Baghdad, Paul Wood, was speaking to us about just a little earlier. He was saying that although this might not be quite the military push on Baghdad as it might have appeared earlier in the day, nonetheless, word had got out that American forces were in some sectors of the city, and therefore Iraqi police and so on had moved out in exactly this fashion, exactly the way we're seeing now.
This does look very much like a parade for the benefit of the foreign press, who are mostly holed up in one hotel. Does very much look like, excuse me, very much like that it's a deliberate show for the media there of the defiance from the centre of Iraq. But this is the first time we're seeing these scenes, armed men in the city centre with some artillery moving around as well. There we go. That's the vehicle we saw just before.
Saddam International Airport has been renamed Baghdad International by U.S. troops who now hold the strategic real estate just 12 miles from the city center. Though still under fire from Iraqi forces, Pentagon officials say the airport will soon be a key fire base from which the U.S. can expand its attacks on the Iraqi capital.
It's a great location on the southwest portion of Baghdad to allow us to posture ourselves around the city or to move into the city.
Nearby are 3 palace complexes, all considered regime command and control facilities and legitimate military targets. And once the entire perimeter is secure and more troops and attack helicopters can be brought in, the U.S. can use the vast airport complex as a launching pad for commando-style raids on centers of gravity for the regime. And one objective that, like the airport, has both strategic and symbolic value is Iraqi television.
Well, the regime determined early on that one of its primary mechanisms for controlling the population and exerting coercion was through its media.
Whether or not the most recent tapes showing Saddam Hussein addressing the Iraqi people and mingling with adoring crowds on the streets of Baghdad are real or fake, the effect is the same, sending a convincing message his regime is still in power. The U.S. has repeatedly targeted television transmitters and satellite dishes, but while the signal goes down from time to time, it always comes back.
It has a very redundant system, starting with fixed sites to include mobile vans that it uses to put out its signal.
Still, bomb damage may have knocked out local broadcasts and limited Iraq to sending satellite signals abroad. With the power out in parts of Baghdad, it's not clear how many Iraqis are watching. But until the television transmissions are controlled by the U.S.-led coalition, the Iraqi people will not believe the claims of the United States. There may be another reason the U.S. is having trouble knocking Iraqi television off the air. Iraq may have moved some backup operations to a Baghdad hotel where foreign journalists are working, effectively using them as human shields. Jamie McIntyre, CNN, the Pentagon.
Idea burned out Iraqi tank there. This is the southwest edge of the city. If you were watching us earlier, we've seen a shot looking from out of the city centre to the southwest outskirts with smoke, presumably that smoke, which we think actually is from burning oil, the tactic they've used over the last couple of weeks. But these are particularly interesting shots in that they do show, you've just seen a burned out tank, and we see another couple more vehicles coming up which have been burned out. Still bizarrely, that activity, civilian traffic along the road as well. Now, Dan Plesh from the Royal United Services Institute is in the studio watching this as well. This in particular, one of the most graphic illustrations of what's been going on there this morning. Dan, what do you think has been happening? Is this the coalition making its push to take Baghdad because they have gauged there is no significant resistance waiting for them, although that tank perhaps suggests otherwise? Or is it them probing and pulling back when they found the resistance?
I think it's a combination. What we're really seeing are the forward elements of 2 major US formations, the Marines in the east and the 3rd Infantry in the southwest, each totaling about 15,000 troops pushing into the city. Now, the American reports are that this morning they had 1 killed and perhaps half a dozen wounded, and that will give them some pause for thought, as that seems to have occurred in the last couple of hours. There has been reports of major fighting in the southwest suburbs and counterattacks with Iraqi artillery and potential suicide bombers, according to American commanders out at the Saddam Hussein at the airport, Saddam Hussein Baghdad airport.
Okay, all right.
Yesterday, we
Information Minister met with reporters in Baghdad in the last hour, and he claims that coalition forces are not in control of even the airport west of Baghdad, let alone entering the city. Well, despite assertions to the contrary by...
Despite the progress made by the 3rd Infantry, actually 2nd Infantry Division, 3rd Infantry Division, 2nd Brigade, taking the heart of Baghdad in recent hours, we need to caution our viewers and say this war is not over yet. I'm with the 7th Cavalry, again, west and a little north of the airport, and we came under fire again this morning. What happened was 7th Cavalry was out on a reconnaissance mission, checking an area where it shot and killed some 20 Iraqi tanks yesterday. This morning, 7th Cavalry went out, CNN with the cavalry, again in the convoy, and we surprised an Iraqi unit of tanks. There were 3 tanks on the right side of the road, two tanks on the left side of the road. We suddenly heard firing. Fortunately, the Iraqi soldiers in their tanks were sound asleep, even though they'd taken up a position, and by the time they knew what had hit them, their tanks were on fire. There were big blazing balls of diesel fuel burning in the air. There was artillery from within inside the tanks, that is the tank shells exploding, small arms fire exploding. We can see that fire has been burning for a number of hours now, but the 7th Cavalry, as I said, was on a reconnaissance mission through an area that it had cleared of tanks yesterday. Again, the Iraqis have not given up. They moved 5 more tanks into this very same area. Less than 24 hours later, the Iraqi tanks were in position to shoot at the 7th Cavalry. It appears, however, the Iraqi tank drivers and gunners were caught sleeping. They were in their turrets, never had a chance to escape because the second visual contact was made. The 120-millimeter guns on the M1A1 Abrams tanks began blasting away at them, and I think we've been showing for the better part of the morning the explosions, the burning of fuel, and the dying Iraqi tanks. 3, as I say, on the right side of the road, 2 on the left. There has been some additional fire. We heard some mortars, anti-aircraft fire, again going over our heads a short while ago, but the current situation seems to have slipped into another lull. Nonetheless, you would not want to be traveling these roads without the 7th Cavalry. This area west of Baghdad, still has irregular forces moving through it, perhaps some remnants of Republican Guard. The entire city is not by any stretch of the imagination safe.
The smiling face of Saddam Hussein was one of the first sights that greeted American tanks as they rolled past what few defences there were on the outskirts of the city. Troops reported sporadic resistance and returned fire using machine guns mounted on their tanks. In amongst the trees lining this route, there were signs of Iraqi positions on fire. There were also some vehicles which had been destroyed by American guns. Although it's still unclear how far the tanks have penetrated, there's no doubt about their objective. Iraqi officials maintain that they are still in control and fighting back the invaders.
The Republican Guard is in full control of Saddam International Airport, and those mercenaries now outside the airport in Abu Ghraib district, and they are surrounded and we are pounding them.
On the streets there were signs of artillery being moved to forward positions, but not in any great number. Also on the move, lighter arms. This, a rocket launcher mounted on a motorcycle. All around, more evidence of the power they're up against. Buildings still smouldering from another night of missile and artillery bombardments, which came before this morning's advance. Harry Smith, ITV News.
Iraq's military heading for the battle for Baghdad. We filmed these artillery guns from our hotel as reports of coalition forces inside the city spread through the Iraqi capital. By lunchtime here, police cars could be seen with the Iraqi flag held aloft, along with the picture of the president. Guns could be seen being waved from the cars, a show of strength in a city under siege. They stopped outside our hotel, determined to get a message out that they're still in control. On the banks of the Tigris, some of the Iraqi troops dug in around an anti-aircraft gun run to their positions as explosions ring out in the distance. This morning, we headed out to the southeast of the city on a bus with Iraqi officials. We were taken to a housing estate where Iraq says civilians were injured last night after a cluster bomb attack by coalition forces. Yassin Mohammed Yassan showed me the damage he said was caused by the attack. Was he worried by reports that American troops were near? I'm fine. I'm not scared by the Americans, he told me. I will fight them.
In unsealed bags and hardboard coffins stacked 5 deep, the hundreds of human remains were found in a makeshift morgue in southern Iraq. British soldiers made the grim discovery at an abandoned Iraqi military base on the outskirts of al-Sahaf. The teeth in many of the skulls had been broken, whilst the bones appeared to be bundled in strips of military uniform.
You come to expect everything in war fighting. the coffins were there. It was a bit more of a surprise when I discovered the bags with the human remains inside.
In a neighbouring building, evidence of cells and a catalogue of photographs of the dead. Most had died from gunshot wounds to the head. Others were mutilated beyond recognition, their faces burnt and swollen. Outside, soldiers discovered a purpose-built shooting gallery, the brickwork behind it riddled with bullets. Arabic identity cards contained the identifications of some of the dead. Forensic specialists will now visit the scene in the hope of establishing how long the remains had been in the complex. Furthermore, they will be seeking any information that may provide evidence of atrocities perpetrated by Saddam Hussein's regime. Emma Murphy, ITV News.
A group of Iraqi Kurds manning this .50 caliber truck-mounted machine gun is heading south towards Baghdad, a little more than an hour's drive away. They are in high spirits, now believing in what they have always thought was the unimaginable, the collapse of Saddam Hussein's rule, now that coalition forces have his regime in their gun sights. This is about as close to Baghdad as you can get from this sector of the northern front, a remote Peshmerga outpost. This route south is blocked by Iraqi front lines. Iraqi troops, or it's thought, Saddam Fedayeen irregular units holding this ridgeline. The Iraqi Kurds have been biding their time here, casting cold stares towards their longtime enemy, awaiting the US military's next move, a move which now appears to be taking shape. Special forces prepare the ground for another wave of airstrikes, pinpointing the range of targets and learning the lay of the land.
This is soldier Saddam Hussein.
This Kurdish fighter says he knows the terrain like the back of his hand and maps out positions for his American allies with a small mosaic of stones. As encircling American forces close in on Baghdad, the capital is all but surrounded, except for approach or escape through the northeastern corridor, an unplugged gap that's unlikely to remain open for very much longer. The armed Iraqi opposition, mostly the Kurds, want to be the first Iraqis to liberate their own soil south of the front lines. They can't do it alone, but under the command and control of their American allies, they might get the chance. Brent Sadler, CNN, near KIFRI, northern Iraq.
Not quite clear what the mission is. Now, this happened earlier today. Obviously, when U.S. forces went in, we were led to believe it was a reconnaissance mission, also a probing mission to determine just how much resistance they might meet. As Walter Rogers has described it, it's much more than that. They're carrying something, I can't make it out. Obviously, there was quite a number of U.S. troops on the ground, actually on the ground in this neighborhood. Many of us thought that it was mostly just armored units rolling through the streets. They appear to be going house to house or from apartment building to apartment building. You can hear some shots being fired. Let's listen. You can see there some of the armor moving around. This is said to be close to a presidential palace. There, the main battle tank, the M1 Abrams. This may be at Abu Ghraib, very close to the airport. I can't be sure. There is a presidential palace in that area of the city, of course. And like the scene you see there, it is populated with hundreds of palm trees. And now we see flames. Unclear, of course, whether that was caused by a bombing strike, artillery, or whether these troops that we've seen on the ground had anything to do with it. There clearly, you have a Bradley fighting vehicle firing its cannon at the airport. They are said to be the complexes that are connected by underground tunnels to the airport. And it may well be those. I think they're at Abu Ghraib is the name that has come up. Rula?
Well, actually, the presidential palace that's on the way from Baghdad to the airport is Al-Radwaniyya. It's a new palace. It's huge. It's very huge. It's consisted of many compounds, many buildings. It has very high walls so that people who are driving by, you cannot see what's inside unless you go up on a bridge, on a very luxurious, it seems from the outside. There are a lot of guard posts along the walls of that compound. It's a huge area for that presidential palace on the way to the airport. Jim?
Rula, if I didn't know better, I would think you've been standing on that bridge peeking into the presidential palace. Let's go to Kelly McCann once again as we look at some of these pictures and get Kelly's military analysis of what we were seeing in those new images coming to us. Kelly?
Coalition forces executing small unit leadership. You're seeing the middle ranks actually maneuver and execute basically initiative-based tactics. I mean, they're figuring it out as things happen, which is truly what, you know, the tactician does on the ground. Of note is...
For some reason, I'm not hearing you.
Of note is that serious consideration of how difficult it is to see individual targets out there that are in covered and concealed
Kelly,
positions.
I'm going to ask you to stand there. I'm going to ask you just to stand by, excuse me. We're going to go to Al Jazeera.
In front of what appeared to be a window. I mean, I would question anybody's judgment if the troops were moving into that area, the coalition forces. I doubt that anybody would do that, and I would suggest that it's probably videotape that was in the can to show a normalcy of life and videotape. I mean, I can't imagine
I don't think so.
with battle that
so.
close.
I think that was the Ministry of Information. That's where all the television satellites dishes were. That scene was a window right outside the Ministry of Information, and it was dusk. The light was right. From everything that I'm seeing here, I think that was definitely live. That's where he would have done a live interview with Al Jazeera. What I think it reflects is the level of concern at the Ministry of Information about these images we're looking at. Rula, Amin, you've been talking a little bit about the effect that it's going to have. It's unlikely that most residents of Baghdad, though, are going to see this. They may hear the minister's messages coming over the radio, but it's very unlikely that they would see these pictures, isn't it?
It's very unlikely that they would see the pictures. There are some families, wealthy families, who have generators in their own houses, and maybe they will be able to see this through satellite channels if they have some. Also, it's the word of mouth, and I'm sure that all the Iraqis who tune in to hear whether it's Iraq...
Defense in depth with primary, alternate, and supplemental positions, just sporadic small arms fire, it suggests that they either withdrew, maybe left a few units, what's called a delict, detachments left in contact, so that the other forces could withdraw to a safer area. But certainly, although it might have at one time have been well defended, it doesn't appear to be that now. Jim? To those forces, should they return and occupy the area, but basically a mopping up operation. Same?
American forces, American commanders today seem a lot more confident. If they're that confident, why don't they just roll into the heart of Baghdad?
Well, I think the key being confident but not overconfident.
Baghdad in half. The Americans claim they can now enter the Iraqi capital at will. It's called reconnaissance in force. American tanks sliced through the Iraqi capital, but tonight in their wake, the same streets are now back under Saddam's control.
Closing in. American tanks and troop carriers probed the southwestern outskirts of Baghdad for 3 hours this morning, meeting only light resistance. For the first time, soldiers from the US 3rd Infantry entered the city suburbs before heading west to link up with troops holding the international airport. From the roadside, occasional bursts of machine gun fire and a few rocket-propelled grenades. But for the most part, the bushes held Iraqi soldiers ready to surrender.
and he's got green trousers on. That's definitely a soldier, telling him to lay down his weapon and get on the deck. The first time we've seen that.
There's a guy, there's right there in the bushes. Right
Watch
there.
out, there's a guy, don't shoot him. Another surrender. They're keeping their hands up. Unbelievable.
But this was not the final push. American troops soon withdrew, abandoning an Abrams tank to Iraqi celebrations. Today's incursion was meant to send a more subtle message that US troops can now move freely in Baghdad and that Saddam Hussein has lost control of his capital.
Coalition troops are, in fact, in the vicinity of Baghdad, do, in fact, have the ability to come into the city.